Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
At dinner, my dad stabbed his steak with the same precision he used when lining up books on a shelf or raking leaves in straight, army-perfect lines, and without even looking up, he said, "You've outstayed your welcome." Just like that. No build-up, no warning, not even a passive-aggressive sigh beforehand. The words dropped into the room like a grenade, quiet at first, then echoing, loud, impossible to ignore. I sat still. I didn't flinch. My knife hovered above the chicken I had cooked myself, using groceries I had paid for, in a kitchen I'd been silently cleaning every day for months. I looked down at my plate, then at my father's eyes, still not meeting mine, and I swallowed the anger that rose in my throat like bile. I didn't say anything, not that night. But I promise you, I said plenty later. You'd think a man who taught me how to hold a wrench before I could ride a bike would have more respect for staying power, but Robert Morton was not that kind of man. He was a blueprint of military rigidity, retired Navy, 3 tours, 2 failed marriages, 1 living daughter who apparently had become an unwelcome guest in the house where she had once learned how to brush her teeth while standing on a stool. My father never needed many words to tear someone down. He preferred surgical strikes, short phrases, tight-lipped silences, and the occasional sideways glance that said more than whole paragraphs could. That night was no different. We had all been sitting there, the 3 of us, him, me, and Debbie, his second wife who had slipped into our lives like fog one winter after Mom passed. Debbie had the uncanny ability to hover right at the edge of confrontation, offering sweetened tea and passive-aggressive praise while avoiding eye contact whenever real conflict appeared. She had made some bland comment about the weather, probably to ease the tension she felt brewing beneath the table, and that's when he said it. "You've outstayed your welcome." 7 words that pulled the air out of the room like a vacuum. I cut my chicken, chewed slowly, and kept my breathing even, not because I wasn't burning inside, but because I knew what he didn't know, and that gave me an upper hand I wasn't quite ready to play. It's funny how people treat you when they think you need them. They get bolder, louder, more careless with their cruelty. They forget the debts they owe you because those debts are invisible, no paper trails, no signed contracts, just sacrifices made quietly in the dark. And I had made plenty. Every damn month since I moved back in after my divorce, I had been paying that man's mortgage. Not splitting it. Not contributing. Paying it. Full. Quietly. Anonymously. Through a side account linked to his autopay that he never once thought to question. Maybe he assumed Debbie was covering it from her pension. Maybe he thought the bank finally took mercy on veterans. Who knows? What matters is that he never once asked, and I never once told until it was time. That night, I said nothing, but inside, I began writing the speech I would deliver when I left, because I knew now, without a shadow of doubt, that I would leave, and it wouldn't be with a whimper. I kept glancing at Debbie, who was fiddling with her napkin like it was the key to disappearing. She never looked me in the eyes, but I caught the guilt in her shoulders. She knew. Maybe not the full story, but she knew enough to be uncomfortable with his tone. Still, she stayed silent, sipping her lukewarm tea and mumbling something about leftovers. I excused myself politely and went up to the room they called the guest room, though it used to be mine, back when the walls were painted lavender and my name was on the door in foam sticker letters. I closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the ceiling. It had been 13 months since I moved back in, broken from a 10-year marriage that ended with a text message and a missing retirement fund. Jason had vanished with a crypto wallet and our joint savings account, and I was too proud to crash at a friend's house, too burned out to start over in a new city. So I came back here. To the house that raised me and erased me in equal measure. I thought I could stomach it long enough to rebuild. I was wrong. From under the bed, I pulled the locked file box I kept hidden behind an old suitcase, popped it open, and flipped through the manila folders inside. Every monthly statement was there, printed, dated, signed. Every transfer. Every auto-pay setup. Copies of emails from the bank confirming my payments had posted. I had built my own little paper trail in case something like this happened. Not because I wanted recognition, no, that ship sailed long ago, but because I knew how easily my father rewrote history, how quickly he forgot things that didn't suit his version of events. And as I sat there, with the dull murmur of their voices floating up through the vent, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not even sadness, just clarity. I wouldn't stay one more week in a house where I was tolerated like bad wallpaper. I wouldn't sleep another night under a roof paid for by me while being treated like a squatter. But I wouldn't scream, wouldn't throw dishes or slam doors. That wasn't my style. My revenge would be neat, clean, and quiet. So I sat back, placed the folder on the nightstand, and picked up my phone. I opened the banking app, scrolled to the automatic payment for the mortgage, and pressed cancel. The screen asked, "Are you sure you want to stop this payment?" And I tapped yes with a calm I didn't feel. I closed the app, turned off the light, and stared into the dark, already crafting the sentence I would say when I walked out. But before I go on, let me ask you something. Have you ever helped someone who didn't even know or care that you were the reason they were surviving? Would you have told them or stayed silent? Because tomorrow I'm going to tell him, but not the way he expects. There's something about returning to your childhood home as an adult that feels a bit like stepping into a museum built in your honor, only to find that the exhibits have been rearranged and your name has been scrubbed off the plaques. Everything is still there. The creak in the fourth stair, the faint scent of lemon polish and old laundry, the way the back door sticks unless you lift it just right, but somehow, none of it belongs to you anymore, and the walls feel like they're silently judging you for coming back after you swore you never would. I remember walking through that front door 13 months ago with a single suitcase, a cardboard box full of office equipment, and a hollowed-out version of myself I barely recognized in the mirror. I didn't come back expecting a hero's welcome, but I did think, naively, perhaps, that the people who claimed to love me might offer a little grace in the aftermath of watching my entire life collapse like a cheap folding chair under too much weight. Back then, I still called him Dad without thinking twice, still thought of this house as my safety net, even if the net had always been woven from stiff expectations and a silent understanding that love was something you earned, not something you were just given. I had spent 10 years trying to build something real with Jason, 10 years of compromise, of stretching myself thin to accommodate his ambition, of hoping that maybe love could be enough to carry the weight of financial instability and two people moving in opposite directions. And then, one day, while I was at the grocery store picking up almond milk and kale, Jason vanished from our shared accounts, our apartment, and my life entirely. One minute we were making plans for a winter vacation, and the next I was sitting in a bank lobby, staring at an empty savings balance and a bewildered teller who kept saying, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do." With nowhere else to go and no desire to explain my humiliation to anyone who used to admire our carefully curated Instagram marriage, I called my father from the parking lot of a 24-hour Walgreens and asked if I could come home for a while. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer sympathy, just said, "If you're coming, come now. I go to bed at 9. That should have been my first warning sign. But I came anyway, tail between my legs, hoping that the sharp edges of his personality had dulled with retirement and time. They hadn't. In the beginning, I told myself the arrangement was temporary, just a couple of months to get my feet back under me, relaunch my freelance work, and maybe even find a place of my own. But time has a funny way of stretching itself thin when you're in survival mode, and before I knew it, weeks turned into seasons, and suddenly it was my second Thanksgiving sleeping in the room that used to be mine. Only now it was filled with Debbie's quilting supplies and a pull-out cot that left permanent impressions in my back. And still, through all of it, I kept paying the mortgage. It had started almost accidentally. One evening, maybe 2 weeks after I moved in, I overheard Debbie and my father in the kitchen, arguing in hushed voices about money. Something about a missed payment, something about borrowing against the equity, and I remember feeling a pit form in my stomach, not because I cared about the financial logistics of the house, but because I knew, instinctively, that pride was a currency my father hoarded even when the actual dollars had dried up. I waited until they went to bed, pulled out my laptop, logged into my own bank, and set up a monthly auto transfer to the mortgage account that was still listed in his name. I knew his login credentials. He had written them down once on a post-it when asking me to help him file his taxes, and I used them, not to spy, but to silently take on the burden he wouldn't admit was drowning him. Each month, I made the payment without saying a word. I didn't want gratitude. I just didn't want to feel like a parasite in a place where I already felt invisible. Debbie found out a few months in. She caught a glimpse of the confirmation email on my computer screen when she came into my room unannounced one morning, but instead of confronting me, she just nodded slowly, as if the pieces had clicked into place. That night, she brought me tea and said, "Robert doesn't need to know. It would kill him." I said nothing, but we both understood the arrangement. I'd keep pretending to be a guest, and she'd keep pretending my silence wasn't the glue holding the place together. The irony is, my father had always preached the gospel of self-reliance, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, of no free rides under my roof, and here I was, paying off the very roof he slept under, letting him believe he was the one still keeping everything together. I didn't do it out of love, not entirely. I did it because I needed the illusion as much as he did. I needed to believe I still had some kind of control in a life that had spun so wildly off course. But lately, that illusion had begun to fray. I'd caught him making comments to his friends on the phone about supporting my daughter and doing my duty as a father, and every time I heard those words, it felt like someone was setting fire to my lungs. I wanted to scream, to shove the receipts in his face and yell, "You've been living off me for over a year, you arrogant bastard," but I didn't. I kept quiet. Because some truths are too fragile to say out loud, especially when the person they'd hurt most isn't even you. I knew the moment he told me I'd outstayed my welcome that the dynamic had to end. But more than that, I knew I wanted it to end on my terms, not as a retreat, but as a carefully calculated exit that would leave him staring at the ruins of his pride and wondering where, exactly, he went wrong. So that night, after dinner, after the silence, after the pain had settled into my bones like cold air, I opened my banking app and stared at the final mortgage payment. It had just cleared. 13 payments, every one of them mine, every one made in silence. The house was now current. No missed fees. No overdue notices. No more excuses. He had everything he needed. And I was about to take it all away. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind of gray, forgettable day that rolls in with thick, humid air and the promise of rain that never quite arrives, and I was sitting in the dining room, surrounded by silence so thick it might as well have been shouting, sipping on a cup of bitter coffee I hadn't wanted to make in the first place, when I heard my father's voice echoing from the living room, gruff, confident, and, as always, just a little too loud when he was trying to sound in control. He was on the phone, probably with one of his old Navy buddies or someone from the VFW, talking in that way men like him do when they need to remind themselves that they're still in charge, still relevant, still pulling the strings in a world that no longer really runs on their rules. He was saying things like, "Yeah, she's still here, and I'm trying to be patient, but you know how it is," and I remember staring at my mug, watching the surface ripple slightly from my shaking hand, thinking, "You don't know a goddamn thing." I leaned back in my chair, careful not to make a sound, because what he said next wasn't meant for me to hear, but it cut through the walls like a hot blade anyway. "She's just freeloading, to be honest," he said, as if I were some stranger he'd been forced to tolerate out of obligation instead of the very person keeping this damn house standing. "I mean, come on, she's 37. It's time she figures it out. I can't keep carrying her forever." Carrying me. The man genuinely believed he was carrying me. That single sentence lodged itself somewhere behind my eyes, and for a moment, I could see it as if it were printed across the sky in big, arrogant letters. I can't keep carrying her. I wanted to laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief, not amusement, the kind you choke on because it comes out sharp and bitter like bile after bad whiskey. He had no idea, none, that the weight he thought he was shouldering was actually mine, that while he was standing tall and proud on the deck of his little sinking ship, I was the one patching the holes below month after month, with nothing but silence and a stubborn sense of duty. And what stung more than the words themselves was the realization that he hadn't just forgotten to thank me. He'd built an entire narrative in his head where I was the dependent, the failure, the reason he was stressed and stretched thin. It wasn't enough for me to be invisible. He had rewritten reality so thoroughly that I'd become a burden in a story where I was actually the savior. That's when something shifted inside me, not the way a switch flips, but the way a foundation cracks slowly, deeply, and with a finality that changes everything. I spent the rest of that day in a kind of mechanical haze, going through the motions of being helpful. I did the dishes, I vacuumed the hallway, I even watered Debbie's dying aloe plant on the windowsill, all while my brain played his words on a loop, like a cruel radio station stuck between stations. By the time dinner rolled around, I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to confront him directly, not yet, not until I was good and ready, but I was going to make damn sure I walked out of that house with the truth in hand, and I wanted it to hit him like a freight train. After dinner, another dried chicken breast and overcooked broccoli situation that no one commented on because silence had become the house's unofficial language. Debbie handed me a plain white envelope. Her hand trembled slightly as she passed it across the table, and she didn't meet my eyes, which was the first sign something was off. I opened it and found, neatly typed and printed, a single sheet of paper titled, Household Expectations and Responsibilities. It read like a lease agreement mixed with a passive-aggressive letter from a roommate who's too cowardly to talk things out in person. Chores, curfews, contributions, as if I were some college student renting a basement from a Craigslist ad. The final bullet point was the kicker. All guests must make a timeline for permanent relocation by the end of the month. I folded the paper, set it on the table, and looked up at Debbie, who was now suddenly fascinated by her placemat, and then at my father, who gave me that look, flat, unmoved, not even cruel, just blank. Like he'd already decided that whatever I might say didn't matter, because in his mind, this was already over. I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because I found it funny, but because that was the moment I knew I had them both exactly where I wanted them. I excused myself, went upstairs, and pulled the lockbox from under the bed. I spent the next hour printing out every single receipt, every bank transfer, every confirmation email, and every tax document that proved I had been paying his mortgage in full every month for over a year. I organized them by date, clipped them together in stacks, and labeled each one with a yellow sticky note: November payment, December payment, January, 2 days early. When I finished, I placed all of it, every carefully prepared piece of truth, into a black binder and closed it slowly, the way you might close a chapter of a book you never wanted to write in the first place. On the front cover, I slipped in a sheet of paper that read only, just in case you're curious how you made it this far. And then I began to pack. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just calm, deliberate movements. I folded each piece of clothing, unplugged my monitor, and coiled the cords with care, even wiped down the desk with a Clorox wipe, because I wanted no trace of myself left behind except, of course, the binder, which I placed dead center on the kitchen table before I went to bed. I didn't hear them open it that night, but I imagined it, Debbie gasping, my father silent for once, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from a realization so sharp it draws blood. And for the first time since I moved back, I slept deeply. Tomorrow, I would walk out that door. But I wouldn't walk out empty-handed. There is a strange kind of power in silence, not the hollow kind that people fill with forced small talk or the kind that sits awkwardly between two people who've run out of things to say, but the kind that breathes with weight, the kind that grows fangs when paired with knowledge someone else doesn't yet possess. That morning, I woke up just before 6, not because I had to, but because my body, honed by months of quiet tension and suppressed rage, had gotten used to rising before anyone else. Just to steal an hour of peace before the day demanded I wear a mask I never chose. The air in the room was heavy, damp from last night's storm, and even before my feet touched the ground, I felt it in my bones. This was the day everything would change, not loudly, not with slammed doors or shouting matches, but with a quiet shift in gravity that would be impossible to reverse. I moved through my morning routine with a deliberate kind of grace, brushing my teeth slowly, folding my nightshirt neatly at the foot of the bed, making the bed with hospital corners, a habit I had inherited unwillingly from the man sleeping in the room down the hall. I walked downstairs, still in my slippers and brewed coffee, the smell rising into the air like a signal flare, though I doubted either of them noticed. Debbie was already up, sitting at the far end of the kitchen table with her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose and a stack of mail in front of her, pretending to sort through bills she'd probably already looked at twice. The binder was still in the center of the table, untouched, unopened, but now a bit askew, as if someone had nudged it while walking past and then quickly pretended they hadn't. I didn't say anything, didn't gesture to it, didn't even glance at it too long, because I wanted it to be discovered on their terms, not mine, and I knew that whatever impact it had would only grow stronger the longer it sat there, quiet and unexplained. Debbie glanced up briefly, met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and then looked back down at the mail like she was searching for an answer that wouldn't arrive. My father hadn't come down yet. Maybe he was still asleep. Maybe he had already seen it. Maybe he was just avoiding the moment where he'd have to look me in the eye and finally realize he didn't know his daughter at all. The silence stretched on, thick and brittle, and after a few sips of coffee, I walked to the living room window, pulled back the curtain slightly, and stared out at the driveway, where my car sat half-packed, its trunk closed but full of neatly organized bags and boxes. I had packed most of it last night, slipping out one item at a time like a thief stealing back pieces of her own life. I had left behind the extra winter coats in the closet, the bookshelf full of paperbacks I didn't care to read again, the second monitor I didn't have room for, but the essentials, the things I truly needed, were already waiting in the car, ready to go. I turned back just in time to see my father enter the kitchen, wearing his usual morning uniform, white t-shirt, gray sweatpants, and the expression of a man who believed routines were the only thing keeping the universe from descending into chaos. He nodded at me once, a bare minimum of acknowledgement, and walked past me toward the fridge. He didn't say a word. Didn't look at the binder. Didn't ask if I had slept well or if I planned on being out long. That was his way. The kind of man who could burn a bridge with a glance and then blame you for the ashes. But Debbie, always the quieter player in the game, chose that moment to speak, her voice soft, almost like she was trying to place the words gently in the air rather than say them. "Rachel," she said, and I turned toward her, surprised not by the fact that she spoke, but by the tremble in her voice. I saw the binder. There was a beat of silence. I didn't move. She cleared her throat. "I didn't know it was all of it," she said, eyes still on the table. "I thought you were just helping a little." I didn't reply right away. I wanted the moment to breathe, to stretch out just enough that my father, who was now pretending to be deeply invested in organizing a fridge full of leftovers, would have to sit in it. Let it settle. Let it weigh on him. "You didn't ask," I said finally, and my voice was even, almost kind, but I knew it cut sharper because of it. "Neither of you ever asked." Debbie opened her mouth like she wanted to say something more, maybe to apologize or to explain, but my father closed the fridge door with more force than necessary and muttered, "That wasn't your responsibility." That stopped me. Not because it was a denial, it wasn't, but because it was the closest thing to admission I'd ever heard from him. I turned toward him fully then, studying his face, looking for any sign that he understood, even a little, the depth of what had happened here. But there was nothing. Just stone. Maybe a flicker of something under the surface, shame, pride, anger, but whatever it was, he swallowed it like he always did. "No," I said, and this time my voice was firmer. "It wasn't my responsibility. But I did it anyway. Because I thought it would help. Because I thought maybe if I showed you I wasn't useless, you'd stop treating me like I was." He said nothing. Just stared. Debbie stood, walked slowly to the counter, poured herself another cup of tea. Her hands were shaking. My father sat down and picked up a fork, even though there was no plate in front of him, and began to fiddle with it, as if keeping his hands busy would anchor him to this moment. I stepped back from the table and glanced at the clock. 7:42. Time to go. "I'll be gone before 8, I said, not as a courtesy but as a warning. "Everything in the car. Keys are on the hook. I left the login information in the binder if you want to check the bank statements." Still, he didn't respond. But Debbie did. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly, and there was something in her voice that almost sounded like fear. I gave a small shrug. the kind that says everything and nothing. Somewhere else. And with that, I turned and walked upstairs to grab the last of my things, my footsteps echoing through the hall like punctuation marks in a letter that had already been signed. I knew they would open that binder eventually, probably together, probably tonight, and when they did, the truth would hit them harder than anything I could have said aloud. But the real victory wasn't in the papers or the numbers or the proof. It was in the silence I had kept and the silence I now chose to leave behind. Because sometimes, the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. The sky was a bruised shade of purple when I stepped outside, the kind of early morning color that only shows up for a few minutes before the world starts pretending everything is normal again, and the birds, annoyingly cheerful in their endless chirping, felt like an ironic soundtrack to what I knew would be the most quiet but deliberate ending I'd ever orchestrated. My suitcase rolled behind me with a soft click against the concrete, and the weight of the last 13 months seemed to shift with every step I took away from that house, not just the physical burden of living with people who mistook silence for weakness, but the emotional weight of never being seen, of being useful but not valued, present but not welcome. I had said nothing at breakfast, had eaten half a slice of toast without tasting it, and when my father sat across from me like nothing had shifted, like the truth I'd left in that binder hadn't rippled through his understanding of who I was, I knew that nothing more needed to be said then. That wasn't the moment. He wasn't ready, and frankly, neither was I. But now, standing by the car, keys in hand, everything packed and aligned for a departure that looked casual, but had been plotted like a heist, I realized this wasn't about him anymore. It never really had been, not fully. It was about me choosing when to end a chapter, not tearing it out in rage, not folding it neatly with nostalgic care, but closing it, firmly, with all the gravity of someone who finally understands that peace is earned, not granted. I opened the trunk to rearrange one last box and caught a glimpse of the envelope I had placed on top, just one page this time, addressed simply to Robert, and inside, a single sentence typed in bold. It was me. Nothing more. No explanation. No plea for understanding. Just the answer to a question he probably wouldn't allow himself to ask. I heard the front door open behind me and knew it would be him before I turned around. His footsteps were always distinct, heavy and determined, like he was walking through life as if it were enemy territory. When I finally faced him, he was standing on the porch in the same clothes he always wore on weekends, worn jeans, navy blue t-shirt with a pocket, bare feet planted firmly like he thought he could root himself into the cement. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I think he expected me to say goodbye the way most daughters might, to offer a soft thank you, maybe a final hug, a reminder that despite everything, I still loved him. But I wasn't most daughters, and this wasn't that kind of farewell. Instead, I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until he shifted slightly like maybe, just maybe, the weight of what had been left unsaid was starting to itch under his skin. And then, with my hand on the car door and my eyes fixed not on him, but on the mailbox at the edge of the yard, the same one I used to paint every summer as a kid, trying to earn his approval with neat brushstrokes and obedient labor, I said the words that had lived in my chest like a buried landmine for far too long. "Oh, and your mortgage payment?" I paused, not for drama, but because I wanted the air to hold what came next. That was me. Good luck next month. The silence that followed wasn't just silence, it was collapse. His mouth parted slightly, as if to speak, but no sound came out, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father stunned. Not angry. Not dismissive. Just stunned. His jaw clenched, eyes narrowed slightly, and his posture, the posture of a man who had spent a lifetime holding others to a standard he himself rarely examined, shifted just enough to let something through. I couldn't tell if it was disbelief or shame or some volatile mixture of both, but I knew he would replay that sentence in his mind again and again, trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew about the daughter he'd written off as weak and dependent. I got in the car without waiting for him to recover. The engine started with a low hum, steady and reliable, unlike the man still frozen on the porch, and as I backed out of the driveway, I didn't look back, not even once. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past the cul-de-sac where I learned to ride a bike, past the old oak tree where we used to hang tire swings and bury dead pets in shoeboxes, past the park where I once sat on the swings as a teenager trying to imagine what adulthood would feel like. All of it faded behind me like scenery on a stage, and for the first time in years, I felt untethered. The truth is, revenge, if you want to call it that, doesn't always come in fire and fury. Sometimes it arrives in the form of quiet truth, calmly delivered, too late to change anything but early enough to sting. I didn't burn bridges, I left the map. I didn't scream, I showed my math. And I didn't ask for gratitude, because what I needed was never a thank you, but a reckoning. As I merged onto the freeway, the sun broke through the clouds in that lazy, golden way it does when the morning decides to forgive you for surviving another night. I didn't know where I was going yet, not really, but for the first time, I didn't care. There was no one to impress, no one to prove anything to, no one watching and measuring and withholding affection, as if it were some trophy to be earned. What I had done was simple, really. I had given them the truth, wrapped in silence, sealed with dignity. And now it was theirs to live with. Somewhere down the road, I might miss the smell of coffee in that kitchen, or the sound of Debbie humming under her breath, or even the click of my father's boots against the floor. But I wouldn't miss the weight of swallowing who I was just to keep the peace. I wouldn't miss pretending. The truth, once spoken, once laid bare, cannot be undone. It echoes. It lingers. And now it belonged to them.